You ever felt the exact moment your life broke in silence? Not a noise, not a scream, not a scene. Just that precise, cold, almost motionless instant when your heart realizes that something you spent years, maybe decades, building has ended without asking for permission. I felt that in an ordinary late afternoon when I discovered that the man I shared my youth with, my dreams, and my nights of fear and hope had chosen to replace our story with someone much younger than me. It wasn't the fact that she was younger that hurt. What truly wounded me was realizing that, to him, all my devotion had become invisible. And it's strange how we recognize the death of a love. It doesn't come like a storm. It doesn't arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes as a pause, too long between one word and the next, as a glance that no longer knows the way back home, as a hand that hides the phone too quickly. Sometimes it comes as the silence of someone who no longer needs to hide anything because he has already decided to leave, even while still standing inside the house. That day, while he spoke little and tapped too much on his phone, I understood without anyone having to explain. Some pains arrive whole, ready, as if they were just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And I remember feeling the ground shift beneath me, as if my own life were trying to warn me that nothing would ever be the same. In that small, painful instant, I knew I was being replaced, not by a woman, not by a face, but by everything I no longer represented to him. Because when a man chases youth, he's rarely chasing a person. He's chasing his own shadow. And maybe that's why I'm here, telling this story to you. Because I know that many women, in many different places, have lived through this same silence. The pain of being left, the sting of being replaced, the quiet humiliation of realizing that all your effort to keep a marriage alive only served to support the comfort of someone who stopped trying long ago. If you're listening now, write in the comments where you're from, your city, your state, your country. Because this story isn't just mine. This story belongs to thousands of women who gave away pieces of themselves until they finally understood that the person beside them never really knew how to receive. I remember his expression when he said he needed some time. That phrase is usually a lie dressed as politeness, but that day I didn't argue. I didn't ask a thing. I didn't beg. I just listened. And listening hurt more than any word could. Not because I still loved him the way I once did, but because I still believed that deep down I had been enough. That my loyalty, my devotion, my sleepless nights, my sacrifices, my body marked by the years, my tired hands, somehow all of it meant something. But in that moment, watching the way he avoided my eyes, I realized he had already decided to walk away without me. That it was her youth he wanted to wear like a fresh skin, to feel alive again. That it was her glow he wanted to use to hide his own fears. That it was her laughter he wanted to use to cover up his lack of courage. And as he spoke, I wondered in silence when it was that I stopped being enough, or if I ever truly was. The truth is, no marriage ends on the day of the betrayal. It ends long before, in tiny details we try to ignore. I ignored so much. The long absences, the repeated excuses, the growing impatience, the coldness during breakfast, the overdone conversations that led nowhere. And that feeling that, when I spoke, he listened out of courtesy, not care. Many women know that kind of silence, the silence that doesn't scream, but corrodes. I was standing right in front of him, yet it felt like I had vanished a long time ago. He no longer saw the woman who had weathered storms, who protected the family, who held the weight of life on her chest so he could breathe easier. And when the person you love stops seeing who you are, they don't need to leave. They already have. Some women say they felt anger. Others say they felt desperation. I didn't feel any of that. What I felt was a kind of emptiness so deep it almost felt like peace. A sad peace, but a clear one. As if I had finally understood that nothing there could be saved. That love can survive many things, but it doesn't survive someone who chooses to ignore it. And maybe that's why I'm starting this story like this. Directly, truthfully, without decoration. Because anyone who has lived through a pain like this doesn't need flourishes. They need truth. They need clarity. They need to recognize, in someone else's words, the things they hid inside themselves for far too long. I know what it's like to be left after giving everything. I know what it's like to grow older beside someone and still be treated as disposable. I know what it's like to hold an entire home upright while the other person only cares about their reflection. And I know what it's like to survive all of it. So before we go any further, I want you to stay with me through the rest of this story, because what came after wasn't weakness. It wasn't failure. It wasn't despair. What came after was something many women never imagine they'll experience. Because when a man leaves you for someone younger, everyone expects you to crumble. They expect you to be humiliated. They expect you to beg or sink to the same level. But none of that happened to me. None of it. And I want you to hear every detail, because this isn't a story about falling apart. It's a story about waking up, about dignity, about silent strength, about a woman who was abandoned, but never ended up alone. And from here, right here, where everything began to fall apart, I continue. Because what came next might be exactly what you, listening now, need to understand. Stay with me. There's still so much truth to be told. When I say that moment shattered my life in silence, don't think the rest of the story began there. Because in truth, the end of my marriage started long before, in the tiny signs we refuse to see, in the subtle clues we push aside so we don't have to face reality. Today, looking back, I can see that love didn't die on the day he replaced me. It had been dying slowly, almost invisibly, like a candle losing its flame even while it still seems lit. But back then, I didn't want to see it. I believed, like so many women believe, that marriage is about insisting, holding on, carrying the weight of two so everything doesn't fall apart. And that's how I stayed for years, fighting alone for something that no longer existed on the other side. I remember when he started coming home later. At first, I told myself it was just work, then just fatigue. He was always a quiet man, but over time his silence grew heavier, more distant. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of someone who no longer cares. The dinner table became foreign territory. The bed grew cold even with two bodies in it. The house started echoing with a loneliness only those who've lived it understand. The loneliness of being accompanied and completely alone at the same time. Many women know this pain. It's the pain of a marriage falling apart on the inside while looking intact on the outside. If you've ever felt that loneliness inside your own home, write in the comments. I know that feeling. Sometimes, simply naming the feeling is the beginning of healing. I remember the small things that make perfect sense now. The way he stopped noticing when I walked into the room. Before, his eyes would find me naturally, the way they do between two people who share a life. Later, his eyes passed right through me, empty, as if I were just another object in the room. He stopped asking how I was, and when he did ask, it was out of habit, not interest. My answer didn't matter, and I learned to respond the same way. Short, quick phrases, the kind you give when you know you're speaking into nothing. The conversations grew shorter, the laughter disappeared, the small gestures of affection became rare, and the worst part is when you try to bring back something that has already burned out. I kept trying to start conversations, trying to understand how he felt, trying to create moments. But it's impossible to build a home when only one person is holding the bricks. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, but I kept going because I believed it was the right thing to do. The problem is, no one can carry the emotional weight of two people forever. Then the subtle changes began. He started dressing up more to go out, got haircuts more often, bought new clothes he never discussed with me, began to care too much about his cologne, his beard, his appearance. And all of that could have been beautiful if it had been for us, but it wasn't. It was for the world outside, a world that no longer included me. Still, I closed my eyes, told myself it was only a phase, that men go through crises, that I needed to be patient, mature, balanced. That's what the world expects from women, isn't it? That we stay understanding, strong, tolerant, that we always get it, always forgive, always keep quiet. But the more I tried, the farther he drifted. I saw the coldness in the small things, the kiss that never came, the hug that turned sideways, the touch that felt like obligation. The marriage was dying, and I clung to scraps as if you could rebuild a home with crumbs of hope. And many times, I asked myself if the blame was mine, if I had changed too much, if I'd lost my glow, my energy, my softness. Society teaches women to believe that when a man pulls away, it's because something is wrong with them. And even though I knew that was unfair, I still caught myself thinking that way. It's painful to admit, but I did. And because I thought that way, I began trying even harder, cooking his favorite meals, keeping the house spotless, trying to look prettier, even when my soul was tired. I lost myself in the effort to please someone who no longer wanted to be pleased. And he noticed the effort, but didn't react. Didn't react because he had already found another place to put the energy that once belonged to us. And the ironic part is that I still felt responsible for keeping everything standing. Somehow, I believed that if I let go, the failure would be mine. So I kept holding on, kept trying to tie together the loose threads of a marriage he had already let unravel. And when I talk about coldness, I don't mean just the absence of affection. I mean the small details that cut deeper than any argument. He stopped asking for my opinion, stopped sharing things, stopped dividing life with me. And the silence between us, once just uncomfortable, became an abyss. Sometimes he'd come home and not even notice that I had spent hours there, alone, waiting for a gesture that never came. I would start talking, and he would interrupt to look at his phone, and nothing hurts more than being interrupted by the glow of a screen that steals the attention of someone who is supposed to be your partner. I could see his eyes were always somewhere else, his mind somewhere else, his energy somewhere else. I just didn't know yet where, or maybe I did know and didn't want to admit it. Many times our hearts know the truth long before our minds are willing to face it, and that's why so many women stay in relationships that have already ended inside. And that's how I lived the last years of my marriage, trying to fix cracks he himself created. And that silent effort wears you down, makes you sick, makes you age. You start wondering if you're still seen, still loved, still a woman in someone's eyes. I want someone listening right now to write in the comments, "I tried alone." That sentence carries the truth of so many of us, and it might be exactly what another woman needs to read while she watches. I tried alone for far too long, and the more alone I tried, the clearer the distance between us became. He grew accustomed to my devotion, as if it were my obligation to keep everything functioning. And when routine becomes stronger than love, affection disappears. He no longer saw me as a partner, as a woman, as a companion in life. I had become part of the routine. And routine, when not nurtured, becomes burden. And so, day after day, the marriage lost color, lost life, lost meaning. I held everything together, tried to disguise it, tried to cover the cracks, but the house was already collapsing. Still, I stayed, because it's hard to accept that something you devoted so many years to is falling apart. It's hard to admit that someone you loved deeply no longer has room for you. And it's even harder to understand that maybe you were the only one fighting for the us. And the more I look back now, the more I see that the day my life seemed to break in silence was only the final chapter of a story that had been written long before. I just didn't know then that everything that came after would change my life in ways I could never have imagined. And that's exactly the part I need to keep telling, because what happened next reveals truths many women need to hear. And it's from this point, from the moment the marriage was already collapsing on the inside, that the story moves forward, showing exactly where all of this led me, and how every detail was far from over. When my marriage was dragging itself through silences, coldness, and absences piling up like dust on forgotten furniture, I was still trying to believe it was just a phase. But deep down, I already felt there was something, or someone, occupying the space that once belonged to me. And that feeling, that intuition so many women have, isn't jealousy or paranoia. It's the deep awareness that the gaze of the man beside you has changed direction. I saw it long before I knew her name, long before any confirmation, long before any proof, because the body speaks, the eyes reveal, the silence confesses. The first time I heard about her was by accident, in a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. A quick comment, a compliment dropped too casually, a muffled laugh. But even before that moment, I already knew there was a new presence in his life. It wasn't exactly about the woman. It was about what she symbolized: youth, lightness, lack of responsibility, the promise of a new life, the fantasy of a fresh start that many men idealize when they refuse to face their own age, their own insecurities, or the natural weight of time. I never wanted to demonize that young woman. It would be easy to make her the villain of my story, but the truth is, she didn't steal my husband. He offered himself. He surrendered himself. He ran toward her glow, like someone trying to escape his own shadow. She was merely the mirror where he wanted to see himself younger, more desirable, more alive. And it's hard to admit that, because it hurts to realize that a love you built over years can be traded for such a fragile fantasy. But that's exactly what happened. Some people think the pain comes from being replaced. It doesn't. The pain comes from realizing you were trying to keep something alive while the other person was searching for novelty elsewhere. That you were holding together the pieces of a marriage while he was looking into another woman's arms for what he should have found within himself. And that young woman, no matter how central she was to the ending of my story, was also the symbol of his emotional escape. She represented what many men seek when they refuse to mature, the illusion that they can start over without carrying the consequences of what they left behind. I remember the first time I saw her, even though it wasn't in person. It was in a photo. He doesn't know I saw it, but I did. And my reaction wasn't anger or jealousy or hatred. It was strangeness. Because she wasn't a threat in the traditional sense. She was far too young. She had that carefree look of someone who hasn't yet lived the battles life always brings. She smiled with the eyes of someone who has no bills to pay, no children to raise, no history of accumulated hurts. She had that glow youth carries effortlessly. A glow we, mature women, once had, but that eventually transforms into another kind of light, stronger, deeper, more aware. And there is nothing wrong with aging. The problem is a world that worships youth as if it were the only currency of worth. The problem is a system that makes so many women doubt themselves at the first sign of wrinkles, of years lived, of life's markings. The problem is the male gaze that, so often, rejects maturity because maturity demands emotional responsibility, conversation, presence. Because being with a mature woman means seeing yourself clearly, accepting who you've become, facing your own ghosts. And many men prefer to run into the arms of someone who hasn't yet learned these truths, because it's easier to look strong in front of someone who hasn't seen life's fragile side. She represented all of that. She represented his escape from his own age, his fear of facing the years, his childish need to feel desired by someone who hadn't yet seen his flaws. And even though she was real, the image he built of her was far larger than any reality. It was a fantasy of freedom, of vitality, of starting over. It was his desperate attempt to prove to himself that he still had time, still had charm, still had the ability to conquer. He wasn't in love with her. He was in love with who he thought he was when he stood next to her. And while he fed that illusion, I was left with the scraps of what our marriage had been. The comparison was unfair. I carried years of life, work, pain, responsibilities, emotional scars. She carried the lightness of someone who had yet to pay the price of growth, and that difference was exactly what attracted him. Not because she was better, but because she was easier. I represented everything he built and abandoned. She represented everything he wanted to pretend he still could be. And this kind of situation destroys any woman's self-esteem, because even knowing it's not truly about you, the impact reaches your soul. You wonder if you should have aged less, though you know that's impossible. You wonder if you should have loved yourself more, even though self-love doesn't fix another person's immaturity. And the cruelest part is that the world tends to blame the woman who was left behind, as if betrayal were proof of her inadequacy, as if the younger woman were a trophy, as if the years lived were a burden. And I carried that burden for a long time, even knowing it didn't belong to me. What helped me understand everything was realizing that she wasn't the reason for the pain I felt. She was just a piece in his story, a piece he used to mask his emotional cowardice. And because of that, I could never hate her. Hate doesn't change anything. And deep down, she too was being used inside a narrative, designed to feed his ego. Her glow became the stage where he tried to hide the shadows he didn't have the courage to face. And no glow can hold that weight for long. I realized I hadn't lost to her. I had lost to the fantasy he created. A fantasy built on his fear of aging, his fear of responsibility, his fear of looking at me and seeing everything he had destroyed. Her youth was just the perfect excuse, the smokescreen, the stage where he could pretend he was still the man he no longer was. And that is why so many women, when they go through something like this, feel shattered. Not because they were replaced, but because they were compared to something impossible, an idealized image shaped by his fear, not by reality. And if you've ever felt that, write in the comments, "I know what this represents," because that sentence carries a truth only those who lived this pain can understand. That young woman became a symbol of something larger, the unfair pattern that treats mature women as disposable and glorifies younger ones as trophies. But I wasn't disposable. I was simply living beside someone who didn't know how to recognize value. And she wasn't a trophy. She was just the reflection of a male insecurity many men hide behind young smiles. Understanding every detail, every wound, every silent impact helped me finally see the truth behind his choice. And that's exactly where my story continues, because what happened after that phase revealed even more about him, about me, and about everything that young woman truly symbolized in both of our lives. And from here, the story goes on. When I finally understood what that young woman represented for him, I realized the abandonment had started long before he announced he was leaving. But hearing the words is different from merely sensing the truth. Hearing gives shape to what was once only intuition. And that day, when he folded a few clothes in silence, tucked away his things without even looking at me, and walked to the door as if he were going out to buy bread, time stopped inside me. He didn't have to say he was going to her. I already knew. And even knowing, the impact was devastating. Not because he left, but because of how he left. No goodbye, no acknowledgement, no gratitude, no memory of what we built together. It was a cold, calculated, practical abandonment. The kind of abandonment that shatters a woman's soul. The silence that stayed after he shut the door was worse than the abandonment itself. I stood there, in the middle of the living room, looking at the empty space where he used to leave his shoes. The house felt larger, colder, hollower. I could hear my own breathing as though I were in a foreign place. There was no one to tell me I was overreacting, no one to hold me, no one to ask how I felt. And in that cruel silence, I felt, for the first time, the true weight of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being without someone, but the loneliness of being forgotten. The loneliness of no longer being needed. The first days were a mix of pain, confusion, and shame. Yes, shame. Because when a marriage ends like this, even when it's not your fault, society makes sure to place the weight on your shoulders, as if the woman failed at being enough, as if she somehow lost her worth, as if the youth of the other woman was proof you aged wrong. And dealing with all of that while the house still carries the scent of the person who left is a silent battle, exhausting and invisible, that only those who lived it can understand. Sometimes, I would sit at the edge of the bed and stare at his pillow, still shaped by years of routine, and it felt like a part of my history had been ripped away by someone who never understood what loving truly meant. I tried to go through the day as if everything were normal, but nothing was normal. His cup was still in the same place, his towel still neatly folded. The socks I had washed still sat in the drawer. Everything in the house seemed to mock my attempt to be strong, and at the same time, everything reminded me I was the one left behind, standing among the ruins of something I tried to save alone. And that kind of pain doesn't just hurt the heart, it hurts the body. I woke up tired, whether I slept or not. The body grows heavy when the soul is grieving. The hardest part was facing other people's eyes. People always know when something happened. There's always that neighbor who notices the car that didn't show up. Always a niece who asks without thinking. Always a distant relative who, after hearing about the betrayal, makes some insensitive comment. And each comment felt like a small cut. I'd go to the grocery store and feel as if everyone knew. I'd go to church and sense pity in the eyes of those who greeted me. And pity is one of the most humiliating feelings a woman can face. We accept pain, accept loss, even accept abandonment, but pity weighs on our shoulders as if we'd committed some kind of sin. And even so, I tried to survive emotionally, tried to breathe deeply, cook, clean, keep some resemblance of routine. And most of the time, I failed. Because the truth is, no one survives the first days of abandonment with perfect dignity. There is no glamour in pain, no heroism in the first steps after being left. There is only disorder, sleepless nights, tasteless meals, tears that come without warning, moments when you stare at nothing trying to understand how everything fell apart so fast. And still, I kept going, because somehow I knew I had to. Many nights I would lie down and stare at the ceiling, trying to understand how an entire life can change in seconds. The marriage was like a body that had been sick for a long time, but I still tried to keep it alive. And now, facing its inevitable death, I had to grieve. A real grief. A grief no one acknowledges, because there's no funeral for what dies inside the soul, no ceremony for the end of love, no official farewell. There is only silence. And that silence fills everything. And when the family found out, the humiliation grew. Not because I felt inferior, but because people, even unintentionally, ask questions that cut deeply. Why did he do that? What happened? Didn't you notice? What are you going to do now? None of those questions have answers. And yet, people ask them as if the abandoned woman were required to explain a mistake she didn't make. And then you feel the weight of guilt that was never yours to carry. And you also feel a deep desire to disappear for a few days, just so you don't have to pretend everything is fine. If you've ever felt that silent shame after being left, write in the comments, "I know this silence." Sometimes acknowledging it is enough to help another woman feel less alone. The days that followed were long. The house felt frozen in time. I tried filling the emptiness by organizing things, moving furniture, doing laundry, but nothing filled it. The emptiness of abandonment isn't something household chores can fix. It's an internal space that only time can transform. And back then, I had no idea that the silence he left behind would later become the same silence that saved me. But in that moment, the silence hurt. It was an enemy, a shadow that followed me through every room, reminding me that I had been left, ignored, discarded. The hardest part was trying to rebuild my self-esteem, because abandonment destroys more than the relationship. It destroys how you see yourself. I'd look in the mirror and try to understand what had changed in me. I searched for flaws, for marks, for reasons, and the more I searched, the more I realized that none of it explained his choice. Betrayal isn't about the other woman, nor about you. Betrayal is about his emptiness, his cowardice, his need to feel alive at the expense of someone else's suffering. But understanding that doesn't erase the pain. The pain stays, it just changes shape. And even while drowning in that grief, something inside me refused to collapse. Maybe because after a lifetime carrying everything alone, I had already built a silent strength he never recognized. Maybe because deep down, I knew his abandonment wasn't the end of my story, even though it felt like it at the time. And it was with that invisible, instinctive strength that I kept breathing, day after day. I didn't know it then, but that silence, that emptiness, that pain that felt endless would become the starting point for something much bigger. Because even though the abandonment made me fall, in that fall I found the ground that would truly hold me. And from this moment, from this point where the pain is so deep it seems there is no way out, my story continues, revealing what came after the silence he left behind and how everything began to transform from there. After that period when the silence seemed to suffocate the walls of the house, something inside me began to move very slowly, like an almost extinguished ember, insisting on keeping a hint of warmth alive. At first, I didn't realize it was the beginning of a rebirth. When the soul is too wounded, any change feels like mere survival. But little by little, I began to understand that the emptiness he left, once a bottomless hole, was actually space. Space I never had while carrying the weight of a dying marriage. Space where, for the first time in many years, I could hear myself. Mornings began taking on a different rhythm. In the beginning, I woke up tired, dragging my feet through the house. But with time, I felt a small need to bring some order back into my life. I started with the simplest thing. I made the bed. Then, I opened the windows. The morning air came in carrying a freshness I had forgotten existed. That simple act, opening the window, made me realize how closed off I had been inside myself for years, how I had stopped breathing while trying to keep a marriage alive that had long been dead. And in that fresh air, in that soft breeze, there was a promise I didn't yet understand, but that was gently pulling me toward the surface. Organizing the house became my first act of self-care. Not because the house was exactly messy, but because cleaning each corner felt like cleaning pieces of myself. I removed objects that reminded me of him, threw away papers stained with bitter memories, moved furniture that had stayed in the same place for years, and for the first time, I realized the house wasn't as small as it once felt. It had only been shrinking, under the weight of our silences. As I dusted the corners, I was dusting memories, hurts, resentments, and every surface I polished, every drawer I reorganized reminded me that there was still life there. My life. There were days when all my strength slipped away from me, days when I simply sat on the couch and let time pass. But even that was part of the process, because being reborn isn't just about standing up again. It's also about allowing yourself to rest after years of exhaustion. It was as if my body was finally understanding that it no longer needed to carry the weight of two people. And when the body understands, the soul begins to respond. I started taking care of my health, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. I realized my body had been showing signs of wear that I had never stopped to acknowledge. I scheduled overdue appointments, had tests done, adjusted my diet. Simple things, but things that required attention. And each appointment I made felt like an act of self-love, a love I didn't know I still had in me. A silent, steady love, as if a part of me were finally saying, now it's your turn. If someone listening has gone through that phase of having to relearn how to care for yourself after being left, write in the comments, I was reborn too. But the soul, that was the hardest part, because cleaning a house is simple, tending to your body is possible, but organizing the soul takes courage. And slowly, I began to find that courage. I started taking walks with no destination around the neighborhood. At first, they were short routes, almost paced by sadness. But with time, I began walking farther. The sun on my face, the sound of leaves moving, the quiet hum of conversations happening down the street. All of it brought me back to life in a subtle way. I noticed beauty in things I had ignored for years while trying to survive a marriage full of absences. During those walks, I began running into people I hadn't seen in a long time. Neighbors, women from church, former co-workers, and unexpectedly, some of them approached me with a gentleness I didn't expect. The loneliness began to soften through simple conversations, light ones, conversations that had nothing to do with pain or betrayal. Conversations about life, about everyday things, about the present moment. I didn't realize it then, but I was building new friendships. Friendships born without effort, without comparison, without expectation. Bonds that reminded me there was still life beyond what I had lost. Those small connections awakened something that had been asleep in me for years. Joy. A quiet joy, almost shy, but real. Sometimes it came in the form of a spontaneous laugh during a story someone told. Sometimes it was a feeling of lightness when I sat down for coffee. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel my presence being diminished by anyone. I was the owner of my silence, owner of my choices, owner of my time. And that, simple as it sounds, was deeply liberating. I also started giving more attention to my work. Before, I was too emotionally drained to truly dedicate myself. Now, with his absence, I realized my focus was sharper. I accomplished more, produced more, felt more capable. It was as if the energy I had once wasted trying to hold a broken marriage together had finally returned to me. That sense of productivity gave me something I had lost long ago: self-worth. I began seeing value in myself again. Not the value he failed to see, but the real value, the internal value, the value of a woman who survived what would have destroyed many others. And sometimes I repeated to myself, like a quiet reminder, I'm still here. Faith also played an important role in that rebirth. I'm not talking about empty religiosity or rehearsed phrases. I'm talking about the kind of faith that grows when you have nothing left except yourself. The kind of faith that sees light even on cloudy days. Little by little, I began to feel a presence inside me that strengthened me on the hardest days. I felt that I wasn't completely alone, even when the house felt too big. And in the deepest moments of loneliness, that faith held me up. The most remarkable part of that season was realizing I was rediscovering myself, because throughout the marriage, I had lost myself. I had hidden behind his needs, behind the house's demands, behind the problems I tried to solve alone. And when he left, I stood there, face to face with myself. No filters, no masks, no excuses. It was painful at first, but then it became freeing. I rediscovered tastes I had forgotten, returned to music I loved, picked up hobbies I had abandoned. I began cooking for myself with care, not out of obligation. I relearned how to treat myself with the gentleness I rarely received. The transformation wasn't immediate. It was slow, quiet, sometimes barely noticeable. But it was happening, day by day, step by step. I was no longer the woman of abandonment. I was becoming the woman of rebirth, the woman who stood up on her own, the woman who discovered her own light after living for so long in the emotional shadow of someone who never valued her glow. And it's important to say that this rebirth didn't come with vengeance or any desire to prove something to him. This phase was about me, about rebuilding who I was before I was diminished, about reclaiming my identity, about recognizing my strength. And the stronger I became, the more I realized that the pain he caused had never been capable of defining my future. I was rising again, even if quietly. And this woman I was becoming, this woman who learned to respect her own silence, still had so much ahead of her, so much to live, so much to discover. And it's exactly from this point, from this slow, unexpected blooming, that the story continues, revealing what happened when this rebirth collided with a truth that was still on its way. My rebirth was happening slowly, almost invisibly, but it was real. And perhaps that's exactly how life works when it wants to deliver justice without making noise. First, it heals the one who suffered. Then, without you having to lift a finger, it begins revealing the truth behind the one who caused the pain. And it was right when I finally began to breathe again that his downfall began. A downfall that had no witnesses at first, but that slowly became impossible to hide, because life collects its debts, and it does so right on time. At first, I didn't know anything. I didn't look for updates, didn't ask, didn't investigate, partly because I was focused on putting myself back together, partly because the wound was still too raw. But life always finds a way to bring you exactly what you need to see. Sometimes it's an unexpected message, sometimes an offhand comment, sometimes someone you run into who drops a sentence heavy with truth. In my case, it was a mix of all of that. The truth arrived piece by piece, like a puzzle I never asked to assemble, but that fate insisted on placing in front of me. The first thing I learned was that the perfect life he imagined with the young woman wasn't so perfect. She wasn't the sweet, innocent woman he idealized. She had her own interests, her own ambitions, her own boundaries. And when she realized he wasn't the charming man he pretended to be, she began showing a side he never expected. Youth has a shine, yes, but it does not sustain reality. And reality always arrives, sooner or later. They started fighting. Not small arguments, fights full of demands, jealousy, insecurity, and financial pressure. Yes, financial. Because that young woman he used as a symbol of renewal also had expectations. And those expectations were expensive. Money to go, money to come back, money to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford. He, who already struggled to balance the bills, even before leaving home, now faced demands far bigger than his ability to meet them. And that began to corrode their relationship. He, who was used to the stability I provided, now had to deal with instability. Emotional instability, financial instability, even moral instability. Because when no one is there to hold your pieces in place, your flaws show in every direction. And that's exactly what he found. The reflection of his own choices, unfiltered, unsoftened, without the quiet care I once used to handle his weaknesses. In time, I learned that not only did the young woman expect more than he could give, but she also had no patience for his insecurities. He, who hid behind silence with me, now faced someone who had no respect for his age, no patience for his limits. Her youth, which once seemed charming, became impatience. Her lightness became pressure, and the supposed fresh start turned into chaos. The truth is, the more he tried to please her, the more she pushed him away. It was as if everything he abandoned was coming back to him in the form of consequence. Things he never valued while he was with me, were now missing. The calm I offered, the understanding I nurtured, the patience I carried, the wisdom time had given me. None of that existed with her, because he didn't find the woman of his dreams. He found the reality he had always avoided. As time passed, the arguments expanded into other issues. Like every relationship built on illusion, the truth began to appear at the worst possible moment. The young woman had other interests, other contacts, other distractions, and when he finally realized it, he discovered he wasn't the only man in her life. I don't know all the details, every person told a slightly different version, but they all shared one thing in common. She wasn't faithful, and he felt in his own skin the same pain he once chose to inflict on me. When I heard that, I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel pleasure or revenge, but I felt something only someone who has been betrayed and risen can understand. Justice. Life has a very specific, very quiet way of giving back exactly what you put into the world. He offered betrayal. Life returned it in equal measure, plus interest, and his downfall didn't stop there. Along with the betrayal came financial losses. He spent what he had and what he didn't have trying to maintain the fantasy. He helped the young woman with projects, trips, bills, took out loans, emptied savings, and when he finally realized it, he was drowning in debt. The friends who once patted him on the back, cheering on his adventure, began to disappear. Because friends of convenience always vanish when the money does. The people who once applauded him now whispered behind his back. Those who once praised him now criticized him, and he began carrying alone the weight of the life he chose. The young woman, after taking everything she could from the situation, ended things quickly, almost indifferently, as if he were nothing more than another passing chapter in her life. And he, who gave up stability, family, and respect, was left with nothing but his own regret. Regret that, from what I was told, came paired with emotional collapse. He began saying he had lost everything, that he didn't know how to rebuild his life, that he had destroyed what truly mattered for something that lasted barely any time at all. He repeated over and over that he messed up, that he was foolish, that he acted impulsively. And that's exactly what it was. Impulsiveness. The same impulsiveness that destroys lives. The same impulsiveness that stole from me the chance of being loved with dignity. Some days, people close to me would say, "He's finished." Others said, "He admitted he was unfair to you." And others added, "He has no one left." And even hearing all of this, I didn't shake, because my rebirth was already happening. I had already understood that his downfall had nothing to do with me. It was the consequence of his own choices. Life doesn't need my approval to deliver justice. It does it because life is fair, even when it takes time. If someone watching this video has ever seen life return what was taken from you, write in the comments, "Life collects." That simple phrase holds a truth many people don't have the courage to acknowledge. But his downfall wasn't only emotional and financial, it was moral too. People who once admired him now felt ashamed of him. Relatives who once supported him now kept their distance. He became a living example of what happens when you trade what is solid for what is fragile, what is certain for what is doubtful, what is real for what is nothing but fantasy. The same people who encouraged him to chase something new were the first to turn their backs when the new collapsed. And while all this was happening to him, I continued my own process. My focus was on myself. I didn't fill myself with anger. I didn't fill myself with contempt. I simply kept going. And the more I moved forward, the more I realized that destiny had been protecting me from something I never would have recognized if I had stayed. He walked away thinking he was freeing himself from pain, but in truth, he was freeing me from him. And it's exactly at this point, when his life begins to crumble while mine begins to bloom, that the story moves forward. Because life still had revelations I never imagined witnessing, and each one showed me that my journey was far from over. Life, in all its silent wisdom, waited for the right moment to tie together the loose threads of this story. While his downfall grew deeper, I kept moving through my healing, rebuilding myself piece by piece, without rushing, without forcing anything, without needing to show the world what was happening inside me. Because when the soul reconnects with its own strength, everything around you loses the weight it once had. And it was exactly when I finally felt whole again, even alone, that life decided to bring him back into my path. It didn't happen suddenly. Life doesn't work with theatrics. It works with signs, and the first sign was a simple message, short, almost timid, sent at a random hour, as if he were testing the water before diving in. A message saying he thought about me. In that moment, I didn't feel anger or longing or desire. I felt only a strange distance, as if that message had come from someone I barely knew. It was astonishing how time, pain, and healing had repositioned my heart. Before, any word from him shook me. Now it felt like reading a message from a stranger with whom I had no emotional bond. After that message came another, then another. He began trying to start conversations, asking how I was, how my life was, how work was going. But I felt that beneath every word was anxiety. He was circling, searching for an opening, trying to get close without admitting what he really wanted. And I kept the conversations minimal, short answers, polite, distant, not out of coldness, but because I no longer needed to prove anything, to him or to myself. I had learned to live without his presence, and that gave me a peace I never imagined I could feel. As days passed, his insistence grew. The messages became more emotional, more confused, more filled with regret. He said he missed our home, our routines, our conversations. He said he realized he made mistakes, that he made rash decisions, that he let himself be carried away by illusions. It was curious to see how life puts the right words in the mouth of someone who once claimed he needed nothing but the new. Now he spoke of missing, of home, of peace, words he never valued when they were right in front of him. Eventually, he asked to meet in person. The request came heavy with an anxiety I recognized immediately, the anxiety of someone who lost everything and now reaches for the only safe harbor he ever had. And when I finally agreed to meet, not to rekindle anything, but to close a chapter, I realized that meeting would reveal far more to him than to me. He arrived looking worn, aged, defeated, not a physical exhaustion, but the emotional kind, the one that weighs on your shoulders, on your eyes, on the pauses between sentences. It was as if years had passed inside him in just a few months. The youth he chased didn't rejuvenate him. It drained him. Life outside the stability I once offered had charged him a price he couldn't afford. And the moment I saw him, I understood that nothing he sought was really about love. He wanted rest. He wanted comfort. He wanted security. He wanted to return to what he once despised. When we sat down to talk, he tried bringing up old memories, tried talking about our story, our years together, our good moments. But none of those memories touched me the same way. I listened calmly, with maturity, with a distance I never imagined I would be capable of, because it wasn't resentment, it wasn't anger, it was simply the end. And endings don't hurt when the heart has already chosen another path. After circling around the subject, he finally said what he wanted. He said he missed me. He said he realized no one had cared for him the way I did, that no one had my patience, my calm, my strength. He said the young woman he imagined a future with had shown a side he didn't expect, that she treated him with disdain, that she betrayed him, that she used him, and now he wanted another chance, a chance to rebuild what he lost, a chance to redo the path, a chance to come home. The word home echoed in a strange way, because emotionally, I no longer lived in the place he left behind. I had built another home inside myself, one built on self-love, rebuilding, and truth. He wanted to return to a place that no longer existed, a place that lived only in his memory, not in my reality. And that realization gave me even more serenity to listen without shaking. He cried, not loud tears, but the silent kind, the kind of cry that reveals defeat, the defeat of one's own choices, arrogance, illusions. I watched him, not with contempt or cruelty, but with clarity, because I knew that the man crying in front of me was the same one who once walked away without looking back. But now he had returned to find a version of me he had never met, a renewed woman, a woman who learned to love herself, a woman who was no longer willing to carry anyone's weight. When he finally asked to come back, his voice shook, not from love, but from fear. Fear of growing old alone, fear of having no one to lean on, fear of facing the world without the shield I had been for him. And listening to him, I realized that what he wanted wasn't to rebuild with me. He wanted to rebuild through me. He wanted to use my strength to fix what he destroyed. And for the first time, I deeply understood that no love can bloom where there is utility. I wasn't his safe harbor. I was the only stable thing he lost. If you listening to this have ever had someone return seeking comfort, not love, write in the comments, "I know this return." That sentence might help another woman realize she isn't alone. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice, didn't dramatize, didn't revisit the past. I spoke calmly, firmly, truthfully. I told him his absence had taught me more than his presence ever did. I told him I had learned to live without him, and that this emotional independence wasn't something I intended to undo. I told him I didn't hold hatred or resentment, but that I also no longer held space. My heart had gone through a deep mourning, and from that mourning rose a completely different woman, a woman who no longer fit in the life he abandoned. He stayed silent, a heavy silence, filled with reality. He understood, right then, that he was no longer welcome, that there was no space for a return, that the woman once shattered by abandonment had rebuilt herself to the point of rejecting emotional leftovers. And in that moment, I realized the real justice of life wasn't his downfall, but my liberation. He left that conversation the same way he left my life years earlier, in silence. But this time, the silence belonged to him, not to me. And it's exactly from that moment, from that late encounter, that exposed truth, that return that came far too late, that the story continues, because life still had one more thing to show me before this chapter finally came to an end. When he walked away from that conversation, leaving behind the weight of a regret that had finally reached him, I stayed seated for a while, quiet, feeling something I didn't expect to feel. Lightness. A lightness so deep it felt like a space opening inside me, as if I had finally put down a burden I should never have carried. The pain, the abandonment, the feeling of not being enough, all of it had been dismantled by a simple truth. I was no longer the woman who would beg for love or accept emotional scraps. And in that moment, exactly that moment, I understood. Life had prepared me to make a choice that would change everything. And this choice had nothing to do with him. It wasn't about punishing him or rejecting him out of pride or proving that I had won. It was about me, about the woman I had become, about the emotional freedom I had fought so hard to gain, about the quiet peace I had finally found after years of trying to survive a story that demanded far more from me than it ever gave. I understood, with an almost spiritual clarity, that going back would be a betrayal of myself. It would erase everything I had rebuilt. It would undo my own healing. In the days that followed that conversation, he kept insisting. Long messages, short messages, messages filled with late promises. He said he had changed, that he was willing to do things differently, that he finally understood the value of the woman who always stood by him. But every word he sent carried the weight of a past I had already left behind. It was as if he were trying to bring back a version of me that no longer existed. And it became even clearer when he began saying that he needed me. That word, need, stirred something deep inside me, because I realized that for a long time I had also believed I needed him. But the truth was, what I needed was to free myself from the idea that love is the same as constant sacrifice. I needed the courage I only discovered after he left. I needed the silence I once feared. And I realized that he now needed exactly what I had already healed from. He needed the woman who held everything together without asking for anything. He needed the stability he threw away. He needed the peace he crushed. He needed the security he never valued. But for the first time, I no longer needed him. In one of his messages, he wrote something that sounded rehearsed, but revealed the desperation he was trying to hide. I don't want to be alone. Those words didn't hurt me. They made things clear. Because right then, it was obvious he didn't want me for love. He wanted me out of fear. Fear of growing old alone. Fear of facing life without someone holding everything together for him. Fear of not having someone to listen, support, or comfort him. He wanted to come back to escape the loneliness he created, but I couldn't be the shelter of a man who only came looking when the world turned its back on him. I spent so many years trying to understand what was wrong with me, trying to find reasons for his coldness, his distance, his betrayal. But now everything made sense. It wasn't about me. It never was. It was about his choices, his emptiness, his constant attempts to run from himself. And that understanding gave me enough clarity to finally choose my own path. A path that didn't include leftovers, late regrets, desperate apologies, or attempts to glue together something that had ended long before. When he asked for another conversation, I agreed, not because I had doubts, but because I needed to look him in the eyes when I spoke. Not for him, for me, because a part of my transformation could only be completed if I had the courage to put into words what my heart had already decided. I sat across from him with a calm he had never seen, not because I wanted to look strong, but because I was strong. A different type of strength than the one I carried in the past, a quiet, steady strength built within my own rebirth. He spoke first. He talked about missing me, about regret, about family, about returning. He said he realized too late the value he lost, that he finally understood that youth fades, but the right woman stays. Beautiful words, filled with late truth, but still not enough to rebuild what he broke. And as he talked, I realized that his pain wasn't my responsibility, because every tear he shed was part of the harvest of the choices he made. It wasn't my job to gather those pieces. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't need long speeches. I didn't need to justify anything. I just told the truth. I told him my life had followed a new path. I told him I found things within myself I never knew existed. I told him I discovered peace, and that this peace could not be compromised by anyone, not even him. I told him I held no hatred, but I also held no love, and that didn't diminish the story we lived. It simply meant that story had ended for me. He tried to argue, to beg, to bring up old memories, to rebuild bridges, but I stayed firm. Not firm from bitterness, firm from self-love, because the choice I was making wasn't against him. It was for me, for the woman who rose from abandonment, for my new life, for my peace. And I told him that. I told him that by choosing myself, I wasn't denying his humanity. I was recognizing mine. And that was the moment he finally understood. He realized the world was not the same. He realized the woman he left behind was not the woman sitting in front of him. He realized there was no room for him anymore. And when he finally accepted that, the silence between us wasn't cruel. It was final. It was the kind of silence that seals a cycle. And at that moment, without even saying it aloud, the title of my story fulfilled itself inside me. I'm not the one who ended up alone, because I wasn't alone. I had myself, I had my strength, my identity, my peace, and he, no matter how many people were around him, carried the loneliness of his own choices, the loneliness of losing what he never valued, the loneliness of someone who no longer knows how to return home, because the home he knew was now a place that no longer recognized him. If you listening to this have ever chosen yourself, write in the comments, I choose my peace. That sentence holds power, truth, healing, and it might help another woman who is still fighting for something that no longer exists. And that's how, in that steady serenity, in that irreversible choice, a new chapter began taking shape within me. A chapter that no longer depended on his absence, his failures, or his late regrets. And it's exactly from this point, from this quiet, profound turning, that the story continues, because life still had something to show me, before this path reached its end. And when everything finally found its place inside me, I realized life had never taken anything away from me. It had only returned me to myself. I learned that aging with grace isn't losing your shine. It's discovering a light that doesn't depend on youth, approval, or companionship. It's a light born from the courage of facing deep pain and still choosing to move forward. A light that grows in silence but illuminates everything it touches. With time, I understood that the worth of a mature woman can't be measured by who stays beside her, but by who she becomes when the world tries to break her. There is a strength that's born only after loss, a wisdom that appears only after the fall, a dignity that rises only when the heart understands it deserved far more than it received. And that strength, that wisdom, that dignity, carried me when everything seemed to fall apart. Life has a curious way of delivering justice. It doesn't shout, doesn't announce, doesn't make noise. Life works in silence. It's in silence that it moves the pieces. It's in silence that it reveals who people are. It's in silence that it returns to each person what they planted. I didn't need to wish him harm, nor hope for his downfall. I simply lived. I simply healed. I simply rose. And while I was being reborn, life placed everything exactly where it belonged. Today, I know that nothing, absolutely nothing, happens by accident. The pain I lived created space for what I needed to learn. The solitude that frightened me was the same solitude that freed me. The abandonment that hurt me was the same force that pushed me toward the woman I was meant to become. And when I look at all of it with a calm heart, I see that I didn't carry a loss. I carried a rebirth. And in the end, the truth is simple. Sometimes the one who abandons you is the one who most needs to learn the way back. But when they arrive, you're already far ahead. The stories we share here carry more than pain and overcoming. They carry the wisdom of countless women who walked similar paths, and every one of them deserves to be honored, deserves to be heard, deserves to be seen. And if this story touched something inside you, know that other stories are waiting for you too. Stories different from this one, but filled with the same essence that guides this channel: truth, strength, and soul. The next video on your screen brings another journey, another voice, another woman whose story deserves to be heard with the same care. It does not continue this story, but it continues the purpose of this channel: to illuminate paths, heal silent wounds, and remind you that no woman walks alone. Watch the next video. It's waiting for you. It speaks with the same depth, the same strength, and the same truth you found here. There is more wisdom to discover, more stories to feel, more matriarch secrets to unveil. Go on. I'll be there with you.